When Donald Trump re-entered office in 2025, many expected a return to chaos, but few predicted how quickly he would ignite one of the most consequential trade feuds in North American history. With a stroke of a pen, he slapped a sweeping 35% tariff on Canadian goods, a move that blindsided Ottawa, bruised cross-border business, and shocked even U.S. governors in northern states. But unlike the reactive, noisy diplomacy of the Trump administration, Canada didn't flinch. It didn't throw punches in the press or call emergency summits. What it did, quietly and methodically, was hit back with precision. This wasn't just retaliation. It was a recalibration of the entire Canada-U.S. relationship. Retaliation the Canadian way. In May 2025, Canada imposed the most aggressive set of retaliatory tariffs in 4 decades, targeting $28 billion worth of U.S. exports. From American beef and pork to pharmaceuticals, processed foods, and manufactured steel, Canada's tariffs struck at the core of U.S. heartland industries. Unlike Trump's scattershot approach, these weren't just symbolic moves. They were strategic economic body blows designed to hit MAGA country directly. Simultaneously, the Canadian government suspended 3 major bilateral trade programs, paused a cross-border energy corridor deal, and revoked tax incentives for nearly 30 American companies operating in Canadian provinces. Not only was Canada signaling its displeasure, it was also signaling a pivot.
If you're done watching corrupt elites rig the system and leave you behind, subscribe now. If you want real talk, raw truth, and zero spin, this is your channel. If you're ready to fight back, hit that subscribe button and stand with us.
A nation redefining its economic DNA. The real story isn't just about retaliation, it's about reinvention. For decades, Canada's economy revolved around the gravitational pull of the U.S. market. But the Trump shock of 2025 became the catalyst for a national awakening. Suddenly, being tied too closely to America wasn't just risky, it was unsustainable. Carney's administration moved swiftly. Trade envoys were dispatched to Southeast Asia and South America. New bilateral deals were inked with Vietnam, Brazil, South Korea, and the EU. Canada pushed to expand the scope of CETA and doubled its trade volume with India. Supply chains were rerouted. Infrastructure funding was fast-tracked to support Pacific shipping lanes and Arctic logistics hubs. By the end of 2025, Canada had signed 14 new trade agreements and had begun phasing out over 4,000 product dependencies on U.S. suppliers. And this wasn't reactionary. It was permanent policy change. Public sentiment becomes policy fuel. On the streets of Toronto, Calgary, and Halifax, the response was just as telling. Supermarkets reported a 38% drop in sales of U.S.-branded items. Travel agencies noted a sharp decline in bookings to Florida and New York. Even Canadian coffee chains began sourcing alternatives to U.S. dairy and imports. It wasn't just government policy that shifted. Consumer consciousness followed. Polling conducted in June 2025 revealed that 62% of Canadians between ages 30 to 55 supported a more independent foreign policy separate from U.S. influence. That's not a protest. It's a generational repositioning, and Carney knew it. He channeled this public energy not into outrage, but into renewal. Our sovereignty is economic. Our dignity is strategic, he told a parliamentary committee. This isn't a war of words. It's a turning of the page. Economic shockwaves south of the border. While Canada reoriented, the pain hit hardest in the U.S. border states. Lumber mills in Maine, dairy producers in Wisconsin, auto part suppliers in Michigan all saw a cross-border demand crater. Local leaders, Republican and Democrat alike, pleaded with Washington for relief. Trump's tariffs are killing us, said one governor at a town hall in Buffalo. Canada was our lifeline. Now it's shutting the door. And yet, Trump remained defiant. On social media, he railed about Canadian betrayal and Carney's cowardice, while promoting a fantasy of economic self-reliance that bore no resemblance to the reality his voters were facing. Meanwhile, grocery prices surged across the Midwest. The price of milk rose 12% in June alone due to Canadian dairy restrictions. Medication shortages, once alleviated by Canadian generic imports, began hitting U.S. pharmacies. Contractors reported delays in lumber shipments, pushing housing costs higher in already stressed markets. In short, The Trump tariff didn't just fail, it boomeranged politically and economically. Behind closed doors, quiet strength. What made Carney's approach so potent was its discipline. No grandstanding, no inflammatory sound bites. Every retaliatory move was calculated, coordinated, and domestically reinforced. Canada's finance and trade ministers worked hand in hand with industry leaders. Subsidies were introduced to protect vulnerable sectors. Indigenous trade initiatives were expanded to support economic inclusion. Green tech investments surged, making up for lost export revenues through innovation. Most notably, Carney's team committed over $30 billion to build trade and energy corridors not dependent on American cooperation. That included direct support for East Coast port expansions, Arctic shipping lanes, and a clean hydrogen corridor aimed at European and Japanese buyers. Where Trump threatened, Carney built. The end of automatic friendship. What we're witnessing is a final unraveling of a post-World War II relationship that once seemed untouchable. For over 75 years, the U.S. and Canada share more than just a border. They shared strategy, values, and supply chains. But now, that closeness has become fragility. Carney, without bombast, declared the era of automatic friendship over. No more assuming that proximity equals alignment. No more tolerating economic disrespect under the guise of alliance. Canada, in effect, declared itself a fully sovereign power. Not just on paper, but in practice. Soft power, hard reality. Interestingly, Canada's shift comes not with threats, but with inspiration. While Trump leaned on force, Carney leaned on example. Canada's ESG commitments, its climate policies, and its measured diplomacy have become case studies for a new kind of Western leadership, one rooted in quiet power. In 2025, Canada surpassed China as the largest investor in U.S.-based clean tech infrastructure, particularly in solar panel manufacturing and lithium processing. While Trump talks about energy dominance, it's Carney's Canada that's investing in the U.S. future, with conditions. And this isn't just altruism, it's leverage. Canada's ownership of critical clean tech supply lines means it now sits at the strategic table in ways America can't ignore. Looking ahead, a future without illusions. So where does this leave us? Trump may still be shouting. The tariffs may still be in place. But the outcome is already written. Canada isn't bluffing. It isn't begging. And it certainly isn't backing down. What it is doing is evolving into a nation no longer defined by what the U.S. gives it, but by what it builds for itself. And in that quiet confidence lies the true blow to American hegemony. Because once a partner learns to live without you, they don't come back the same way. The world starts taking sides. As Canada tightened its trade strategy, the rest of the world watched closely. From Berlin to Jakarta, Carney's calm defiance became a case study in how middle powers could push back against economic bullying. In Europe, where Trump's tariff threats against the EU loomed like a thundercloud, Canada's response was seen not only as justified, but heroic. The European Union, quick to recognize the shift in momentum, accelerated talks with Canada on expanding the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement (CETA). By September 2025, 5 new bilateral addendums were added to the agreement, covering digital services, rare earth minerals, pharmaceuticals, and semiconductors. These weren't symbolic. They represented a strategic pivot by Europe toward Canada as a stable, rules-based economic partner in a chaotic global environment. In Tokyo, Seoul, and New Delhi, Canada was suddenly on speed dial. Japan signed a historic energy security memorandum with Ottawa, guaranteeing LNG imports through 2035. India expanded its agricultural import quotas for Canadian grain and pulses. South Korea agreed to co-invest in Canadian battery manufacturing, committing over $1.8 billion in joint projects by early 2026. This wasn't just trade, it was trust. And that trust came with geopolitical consequences. The United States, cornered by its own arrogance. Inside the White House, the mood was frantic. Trump had not anticipated a coordinated international front. His economic advisors, divided and discredited, failed to present a unified response. The tariff-first strategy that once played so well to nationalist crowds was now costing American farmers, manufacturers, and exporters real money and real jobs. Auto parts suppliers in Ohio and Indiana reported a 17% year-over-year revenue drop due to Canadian retaliatory measures. U.S. soy exports to Asia, long rerouted through Canadian ports for better trade access, collapsed. The ripple effects from lumber shortages drove up housing costs in suburban Texas by as much as $8,000 per unit. American pharmaceuticals that relied on Canadian components faced production slowdowns, prompting temporary shortages of generic medications across several states. And while Canada moved forward with trade diversification, the U.S. found itself increasingly isolated. Even traditional partners like Germany and France began quietly reshuffling trade priorities. American diplomats, once courted for their influence, now found themselves defending erratic decisions and making apologies for the president's errant outbursts. Carney's global strategy gains momentum. Mark Carney's strategy was never about tit-for-tat. His playbook was long-term, deeply institutional, and international in scope. While Trump raged at rallies about Canadian betrayal, Carney hosted discreet energy roundtables with Gulf states. While Trump tweeted threats at European leaders, Carney coordinated trilateral meetings with Australia and New Zealand to establish clean energy interoperability standards. By the end of 2025, Canada had formalized the Pacific Economic Cooperation Group, PCG, a mini-alliance of stable democracies focused on sustainable trade, digital rights, and energy resilience. This group, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and Chile, began harmonizing carbon credit markets, ESG rules, and data privacy regulations. To the world's surprise, it was Canada, not the U.S., that was setting the new rules of the road. Even the IMF and World Bank took note. In December 2025, Canada was invited to chair the Global Trade Modernization Forum, replacing the U.S. for the first time in 3 decades. It was a subtle but stunning rebuke of American leadership and a nod to Canada's rising credibility. Domestic U.S. pressure mounts on Trump. Back in Washington, the political blowback intensified. A bipartisan group of lawmakers from the Midwest and New England sent a letter to Trump demanding an immediate end to the Canadian tariffs, citing economic damage, collapsing export markets, and rising inflation. Republican governors of Montana, North Dakota, and Vermont, states with heavy reliance on Canadian trade, warned that they might defy federal policy by seeking their own state-level trade partnerships. A Bloomberg analysis showed that Trump's tariff policies had cost the U.S. economy an estimated $220 billion by the end of 2025, including lost GDP, job losses, and increased consumer prices. His approval rating among independent voters fell to 31%, the lowest of his post-re-election term. And yet, Trump refused to back down. In a speech to a conservative economic forum, he declared, "If Canada wants to play tough, we'll play tougher. They need us, we don't need them." But the data told another story. Over 3,800 U.S. businesses had filed trade complaints citing unfair retaliation from Canada. American companies with operations in British Columbia, Quebec, and Ontario reported rising tax liabilities and regulatory restrictions. And perhaps most damaging of all, U.S. firms were being quietly frozen out of international infrastructure bids that Canada co-financed with its new partners. The Arctic becomes a new front. One of the most symbolic shifts came not from Ottawa or Washington, but from Nunavut. In 2025, Canada and Norway jointly launched an Arctic Resource and Transit Initiative aimed at mapping and building infrastructure across the North for rare earth extraction, fiber optic cable laying, and shipping. The initiative, open to members of the Arctic Council, deliberately excluded the United States. Russia, while not directly involved due to sanctions, voiced support for the exclusion of unpredictable actors from sensitive Arctic projects. China, always watching, saw the move as a green light to deepen ties with Ottawa and other sectors, including clean tech and digital finance. For the first time in modern history, the United States found itself strategically frozen out of a major North American initiative on its own continent. Cultural and institutional shifts in Canada. The deeper effect of Trump's tariffs wasn't just economic, it was cultural. In schools, Canadian history curriculums began emphasizing trade independence and post-colonial sovereignty. Think tanks and universities launched research institutes focused on post-American economics. A new national scholarship was introduced to fund students studying international law, trade diplomacy, and sustainable development in regions beyond the United States. Even Canadian pop culture reflected the shift. Commercials proudly featured 100% non-American supply chain labels. Popular shows and movies emphasized Canadian ingenuity and self-reliance. News programs stopped using Washington as a default reference point for foreign affairs and began quoting sources from Brussels, Seoul, and Brasilia. It wasn't a rejection of America, but a profound decentering of it. By late 2025, trust had become the central currency of global trade. While Trump's America demanded loyalty through intimidation, Carney's Canada offered trust through reliability. Global companies began routing critical supply lines through Canadian ports. Financial institutions began shifting investment portfolios toward Canadian sovereign bonds. Even big tech began expanding data centers in Ontario and British Columbia, citing regulatory predictability and strong privacy laws. This wasn't just a reaction to tariffs. It was a rebalancing of who the world sees as a safe bet. For the first time, Canada was being spoken of not as America's sidekick, but as its alternative. Canada's response to Trump's 35% tariffs wasn't just a counterstrike. It was a global repositioning. As the U.S. burned diplomatic bridges and threatened allies, Canada built corridors of trust, strategy, and resilience. In the long run, these moves might reshape not only North American power dynamics, but the very architecture of 21st century global leadership. By the beginning of 2026, global headlines had stopped asking if Canada was emerging as a geopolitical force. The consensus was clear: Canada had arrived. What made this rise remarkable wasn't its size or military might, but its consistency, credibility, and cooperation-first diplomacy. It was a power built not on bluster, but on trust. In an era where many democracies were faltering under populism and short-termism, Canada projected a rare quality: stability. Mark Carney, now not only Prime Minister, but a global economic figurehead, began receiving invitations that used to be sent exclusively to U.S. presidents. Davos, the G20, ASEAN+, the EU Strategic Council. Carney's presence became a standard. He wasn't there just as Canada's leader, but as the architect of a new global model that smaller and mid-sized powers aspire to emulate. Carney didn't posture as a savior. He spoke in careful, measured tones, always emphasizing partnerships over posturing. And that humility, paired with clear strategy, drew in nations tired of being strong-armed by larger powers. U.S. tries to reset, but it's too late. Back in Washington, political tides were shifting. Trump's approval numbers continued to plummet, especially among business leaders who had once supported his tough-on-trade rhetoric. His core base remained loud but increasingly isolated. Governors in key battleground states publicly demanded a reset in trade relations with Canada, warning that continued hostility would lead to economic implosion in border economies. By spring 2026, under immense pressure, Trump attempted to pivot. He announced he would consider easing the 35% Canadian tariff if Ottawa comes to the table with respect. But it was too late. Canada had already moved on. Behind closed doors, Carney's cabinet debated whether to even reopen talks with Washington. The logic was simple. Why return to an unreliable partner when newer, more stable partnerships were already yielding results? A confidential memo from Canada's Foreign Affairs Ministry leaked to the press in March 2026. It read, in part, "Our priority is to build a diversified network of trade and strategic alliances that insulate our economy from unpredictability. The United States, in its current state, does not meet that requirement." It was a diplomatic way of saying, we're done chasing. The rise of the North Atlantic quiet bloc. By mid-2026, analysts began using a new term, the quiet bloc, to describe the emerging coalition of Canada, the EU, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Unlike traditional power alliances, the quiet bloc didn't make joint military declarations or issue threats. Instead, it focused on harmonizing trade, climate policy, digital rights, and clean energy. Canada led several of these initiatives. A joint AI regulatory framework with France and Germany, a Pacific Battery Alliance with Japan, a new LNG shipping lane treaty signed with Chile and Indonesia. While Trump's U.S. threatened tariffs on allies over every minor disagreement, the quiet bloc standardized how data was transferred, how green tech was certified, how carbon offsets were measured. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective, and businesses noticed. Tesla opened a new battery plant in Quebec. Nestle moved its global ESG compliance office to Toronto. Goldman Sachs announced a $4 billion investment in Alberta's carbon capture industry. Canada wasn't replacing the United States. It was offering something the U.S. had stopped offering: reliability, a cultural realignment within Canada. The trade crisis that began with Trump's tariffs did more than shift international policy. It rewired Canadian identity. For decades, Canadian culture had subtly defined itself in contrast or proximity to the U.S. But now, an unmistakable sense of sovereign confidence was taking root. Canadians weren't waiting for U.S. cues. They were building something different. In public schools, economic literacy and international cooperation were added to the national curriculum. Canadian films, music, and fashion enjoyed a renaissance, no longer overshadowed by American imports. Universities invested in programs to train the next generation of global diplomats, trade lawyers, and clean tech innovators. At the border, crossings into the U.S. dropped to the lowest levels since the 1990s. Travel agents reported a surge in Canadians choosing Europe and Asia for vacation and business travel, bypassing the U.S. entirely. Major Canadian retailers pulled back from U.S.-based supply chains, focusing on intra-Commonwealth and Asian manufacturing alternatives. Even sports leagues got involved. Canada launched its own parallel hockey tournament in response to chaotic U.S. regulations, with surprising international support. The American public begins to wake up. While Trump dug into his narrative of victimhood, ordinary Americans began asking harder questions. Why were their prescription drug costs still rising? Why were Canadian goods now more expensive or gone altogether? Why was their local lumberyard out of stock? Why were major Canadian firms relocating regional headquarters to Europe instead of opening branches in the U.S.? Public opinion began to shift. Polling in late 2026 showed that 61% of Americans believed the U.S. had mishandled its relationship with Canada. For the first time, a majority of Americans agreed that the U.S. should follow Canada's lead on climate, trade, and digital privacy. News networks once loyal to Trump began airing quiet criticisms. A CNN special titled "The Canada Pivot" documented how the U.S. had gone from trusted partner to global wildcard, and how the world had adjusted accordingly. The turning point: infrastructure and identity. In a symbolic move in December 2026, Canada and the EU inaugurated the Northern Digital Silk Road, a multi-billion-dollar fiber optic route from Newfoundland to northern France, bypassing the U.S. internet infrastructure entirely. The project, jointly funded by Ottawa and Brussels, was hailed as the future of digital sovereignty. Trump's reaction was predictable. He called it a traitor's pipeline of wires. But few were listening. The world had moved on, and Canada had moved up. The final arc of the story centers on Canada's new role, not as a follower, not even just as a partner, but as a blueprint. Developing nations began studying the Carney doctrine as a playbook: strategic diversification, non-confrontational retaliation, alliance building through values, economic insulation via infrastructure, climate-forward policies rooted in science and diplomacy. This wasn't ideology. It was strategy. Canada didn't shout, but it reshaped the conversation. When global crises erupted, another pandemic threat, cyber attacks, currency volatility, it was Canadian officials, not American ones, who were often called to help mediate, coordinate, and respond. In 2027, a Canadian-led climate finance coalition helped stabilize 5 small island nations facing bankruptcy from climate costs. In 2028, Canada helped broker a carbon border agreement that finally brought Brazil and India into climate compliance. In 2029, Carney addressed the UN General Assembly and was greeted with a standing ovation. His message was simple: power is not how loudly you speak, it's how many choose to listen. This video transcript concludes not with the fall of America, but the rise of a quiet, competent, and confident Canada. Trump's tariffs may have triggered the crisis, but Canada's calm deliberate response rewrote the rules of engagement for modern economic power.